conectá-lo com novos investidores. Dados recentes mostram que recebemos recorde de 9,3 bilhões de dólares em novos investimentos em Venture Capital. E as oportunidades são muitas, com históricos de investimentos no Brasil em áreas como Fintechs, Retail Techs, EdTechs, Agritechs e Healthtechs. É mais do que um ecossistema de inovação, é uma nova economia no coração da América Latina.
Fórum de Investimentos Brasil 2022. Brasil, Hub de Venture Capital na América Latina.
Welcome again. Experiencing extensive growth in recent years, private equity has become one of the forces of the Brazilian economy. In 2021 alone, the sector's investments aimed at active startups hit $9.4 billion, which represents an increase of 165% compared to 2020. But there is still room for more international participation and new foreign investments. In this regard, how can Brazil become an increasingly attractive destination for venture capital and private equity investors? We'll check this out in this panel, which will have the participation of our panelists. And thank you for being here. James Mawson, the CEO of Malsoni and the founder of Global Corporate Venture. So thank you, Mr. Mawson. Eduardo Zaidan, the founder and COO of Future Capital. Peter Seifert, the founder and CEO of Veiltech Capital. Piero Minardi, president of ABV Cap and the managing director of Warburg. We'll start passing the floor to Mr. James Mawson, our moderator, and I'm very happy to pass the floor to you, James. Thank you very much for being here. Ludmila, muito obrigado.
So I will ask my questions in English, but the panelists will be delighted to speak in Portuguese to make it easier for you all. So to start with, I will ask each of the panelists to give a little bit of introduction about themselves and their firms, and then we will ask you all to give a show of hands about whether you think Brazil is the hub for innovation in Latin America, and then we will use part of that answers in how we will answer. So, Eduardo, please, can you say a little bit more about yourself?
Obrigado, James.
So thank you, James. My name is Eduardo Zaidan, and I'm the founder and CEO of Future Capital, and I'm an entrepreneur. I have been so for a very long time, since as a teenager, and I have entrepreneured in a number of different sectors. 5 years ago, we decided, myself and 3 other partners with the same background, we decided to found Future Capital to develop and help investments in startups, in particular in early stage venture capital startups, so that we could get companies out of the paper and help them grow throughout along the time. Hello, my name is Peter Seifert, and I'm founder and CEO of Veiltech Capital. I've been monitoring this system since 1992 when I graduated in economy, and from then now the system has increased a lot. And I was a CBC head in between 22 to 2020, and I created some venture capital funds for Embraer, and Embraer Venture is one of those funds. And since 2020, I've dedicated to Veiltech, and we've already created 6 CVC funds. And as I noticed, this is what we missed back then, who were focused on venture capital, on the venture capital industry, and would help people to develop their funds related to it. Hello, my name is Piero Minard, and I'm wearing 2 different hats. I've been the president of the Brazilian Venture and Capital Equity for since 2019, and I went through many companies, and we are now working at Warburg, which is a fund, investment fund that has over 1 billion reais here in Brazil, and some of the companies are pets and other companies that are technology related. But the idea here is to share with you a little bit of what is happening now and what it will be in the future, what the perspectives are and expectations are for the future as well.
Obviously, let me say thank you to the Brazil Investment Forum for the invitation to be here. And first, I want to thank IDB and BNDES for their work back in the 2000s for creating much of the venture capital ecosystem that we have all benefited from over the past 20 or so years. So a quick show of hands for those in the audience. It'd be great to see, do you think that Brazil is the primary hub for venture capital in Latin America? Show of hands for people? Yeah, I think most, not all though. This is interesting. Do people think perhaps Florida is perhaps more of a hub for venture capital in Latin America now? Anyone for, yeah, a couple at the back? Interesting. Any other suggestions? Perhaps Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Chile? Any suggestions for those other regions? No, okay, so it looks like the overwhelming view of the attendance here is that Brazil is that hub, which I think we will dive into in a little bit more detail about why that might be. But if I think about, from my perspective, obviously I come from the UK, I come from England, and what we've been doing for the past 12 or so years is looking at how do corporations invest in startups directly, or as a limited partner in venture capital funds that might then take stakes, or through people like Peter at Valitech as a venture capital as a service model. But what we found over the past dozen or so years since 2010, back then, the entire global venture capital ecosystem was centered primarily on Silicon Valley and certainly on the USA. The entire venture ecosystem back in 2010-11 was about 67 billion US dollars. And almost all of that came and went into the US. But since then, the US is now about 50% of the entire venture ecosystem, which has grown almost tenfold to about 600 billion US dollars last year, according to PitchBook data. And corporations were involved in almost half of that, nearly $300 billion. And so the role of venture has grown and changed over the past 10 years. And Brazil is increasingly important both for the activity of the local corporations as well as the international ones which are coming here and then viewing the rest of Latin America through as a prism into the rest of Latin America. And so that close connections between the US, the UK and Europe, China and Japan and the rest of Asia into a globalized ecosystem for venture is really important. So I think we will be looking and discussing about Brazil as this context as a hub, not just as a local hub, but how does that hub play and flow internationally? And I think what we see is the types of hot money coming in and going out of venture is less important to an ecosystem than the wonderful work of people like Pierre at Warburg Pincus, the private equity firms, the venture capital firms that think about long terms, they think about decades. And increasingly we see corporations having a catalyst role to help buy those startups, as well as see them become floated on stock exchanges. And we also see the corporations have the role as a primary producer of that research through work with universities and through R&D. And so what we're seeing is this globalization creates opportunities and threats for Brazil. And so perhaps I could ask Piero to drill down a little bit more through your work at ABVCAP as well as at Warburg Pincus. What is the data? What are you seeing in terms of Brazil and Latin America more importantly?
Thank you. Muito obrigado.
So, thank you. Before anything else, I would like to thank Apex and the IDB for having me here and on the person of Jamie, who so kindly brought us here, and the agreement that we have between ABV Cap, because we are not an exporting agency. We are an importing company of something that is very important, which is capital, and we have an agreement with Apex, which has been going on for the past 10 years and brought over 70 projects financed and invested along with Brazilian investors, and that is about $20 billion for the past 10 years. And what are you talking about here? We are talking about, based on the question that was asked, about an ecosystem that was very intensively developed in Brazil for the past years, specifically related to venture capital. I usually say that we are not so noisy as we should be related the importance, the dynamic importance of that ecosystem. And for those who is aware of what's going on, from 2006 to 2007, Brazil has over 200 IPOs, and about 60% of those IPOs had some fund behind them, a private equity or a venture capital fund behind it. So 60% of what the market capital is that was born in the first half of this century, because it used to be dead before that. I believe that we do not have that visibility yet, or we don't grasp how important that capital is for Brazil, and the sort of capital that we are bringing in Brazil. We are bringing in a long-term capital, a capital that takes risk, and that helps people, helps company grow, and helps entrepreneur to become competitive internationally. We are bringing in capital that at the first moment has many people in wanting to make their business formal and wanting to make use of this moment to grow. So this capital is very virtuous. So it's not something that, as we saw in the beginning of the year, get in. This is not something that will leave after the first spin. So this is not that will leave the country at the very first crisis, or will leave the entrepreneurs behind, or even Brazil, because better opportunities appeared somewhere else in the world. So this is the least known side, or least explored side related to what we are. People usually like to see unicorns, etc., but we should not see as a financial vehicle. We have to be seen as a vehicle of development, of entrepreneurs, or capitalism, of market capital markets in Brazil, but the way it should be, the correct way, and in a country that has the difficulties that we have and that entrepreneurs face to access capital costs and financing costs and so on. And I think that's a very important point for us to address. But statistics are like what I will really talk about now. We have over $10 billion US dollars invested in venture capital, but Brazil now has over 50 unicorns, and out of those 50 unicorns in Latin America, Brazil has 27, and that's a reflection of what has happened in this last cycle, a reflection of entrepreneurship in Brazil and of the debottlenecking of Brazil, because the truth is that you can earn as much money as you want, but the question of being technically available to perform the solutions that we have. But if you do not have broadband connection, cabled connection at your door, you will not be able to do anything. So, and this technology has made the venture capital world launch, and this is part of this phase that we are going through right now. So the Brazilian ecosystem now is something that is out there for a very long time now, and has connected with you from the first half of this century. You have BIF Cap, and we have over 200 associates, and half of those nearly are managers who are out there, who graduated as such, and we also have several providers. But the ecosystem that we have in Brazil for investments is a very sophisticated one, and this is based on my own experience as a Warburg manager, and this company was a pioneer in India, in China in the 1990s, and it's been in the U.S. since 1966, and it's one of the oldest venture capital houses worldwide. It's also present in Asia and Southeast and in Europe, so it's like a very important benchmark of how those systems are abroad. And talking to some partners and colleagues, we can get that idea. But the Brazilian is very sophisticated and very well prepared. It's very ready because we have going through a history of over 20 years now, and everything is bearing fruit right now, and that will impact here as well. So after all this, and one last piece of information, we have such figures, and that is in line with what mentioned in the very beginning of this session. We have $1 trillion US of investments in private equity every year, and that's the ABM company statistics. Okay, so $1 trillion US, and we are collecting less than 0.1% of those figures to Brazil. Now, and this is something that we'll discuss in the future. Why? But I'm not making any prior comments. But in such an environment, it's not a whole bunch of money. So we have now a unique opportunity. And the fact that Brazil has proved to be a hub for venture capital in the past year, and it's attracting the attention of worldwide investors, and also and regardless of the program that we are going through right now in Brazil. So Brazil, in Latin America, Brazil actually has gotten into the radar of those investors. It was not so a few years ago, but now it has gotten in that radar and producing very important fruit. So this is something that we'll discuss in the future and let the other panelists speak. So
obviously, that $1 trillion that Piero was talking about, but how do you see that the role of corporates play in corporate venture capital, either directly or indirectly through firms such as yourself?
A atividade de corporate venture
capital. So the corporate venture capital activities has increased in the world since 2010 at a rate of 30% a year. And Brazil is a late runner in this trend. So just remember that the very first fund that I raised at Embraer back in 2014, it's called FIP Spatial. That was the very first aerospatial industry fund in the world. And in Brazil, we had 2 or 3 cases of CVCs. That means equity participation investments in corporations. Up to 2018, I created another 3 funds, and 2 in the Silicon Valley, Catapult, and Catapult Opportunities 1, to invest in the autonomous vehicle ecosystem, and that was something made hand in hand with Mercedes-Benz, but that was in 2018. But back then, we could count in the fingers of your hands how many cases we had for Brazilian CVCs investing in well-structured programs. And this changed a lot from 2019 onwards. And I could say that from 2019 or 2021 or 22, Brazil catches up and gets into that global wave, and with a very intensive growth. And if we take that analyzed growth from 2019, we can see that Brazil surmounts that 30% of growth a year. But this month, we've already had many announcements of corporations building their funds, like Suzano, paper manufacturer, and B3 in the past 3 weeks. We see that as well. And Vale, the mining company, well, it's been just 3 days now. It's really impressive how CVCs have, Brazilian CVCs have increased that strongly. And the reason for that is, first of all, before that, we should understand why that is taking place in Brazil. It's interesting to know that CVC is a fundamental link or a very important complement to the innovation system. It's a capital that gets in companies to generate liquidity in the market, both for VCs and angel investors that are making their equity investments in startups, for instance. And we have a high synergy, and the operation of CVC gets as a twin brother of corporate strategies for M&A, so they go hand in hand, and they work very close together, but independently, nevertheless. And they have these very different mindsets that are going on. So they are autonomous, independent, but they work close together with the M&A of many corporations. This is the case of many companies. It complements the ecosystem. It's as important as angel investments are, and it's as important as VC. So today, more than 1/3 of all the investments in the world involving VCs, at least 1/3 of those operations have been CVC. So in Brazil, this is something that is growing, as I said, in the past 3 years, and it is great. So for instance, I believe that now, this year, for 2022, we from Veritech, we are in the forefront of helping people structure the funds. We see that the number of corporations operated in CVC will be equal to or higher than the past year, which was already a record. And perhaps we should even surmount that figure, even though the interest rate has increased, even though, and I believe that we could even have some retraction because of that interest rate, but unlike that, CBC will remain strong or even surmount the figures of 2021. And then we got a why. And why this global movement? So it's consolidated itself as a mandatory corporate strategy. It's a new corporate function. As much as you have compliance, marketing, now you have CVC. It's a new function, which is almost mandatory. So you're either doing that in-house, or you'll be hiring another company to do that, like Veotech. This is the kind of service that we provide. But we are now living an environment that has been increasingly accelerated in terms of technology. We have new disruptive technologies popping up every now and then. We have new product services industries popping up almost every day, and they are creating opportunities for disruption in new sectors, new business, and also that creates disruption for corporations. They should be even become protagonists of this CVC system, or they become a victim of that trend. And this comes as a response to that strategy from the companies, given that context.
To see the importance and how much that you personally have done to make this happen around corporate venture capital. Peter's work at Embraer, but I think your PhD was in 2004, looking at corporate open innovation. So that almost 20 years of understanding has really started to change the whole ecosystem. And obviously the work that ApexBrasil and Jamie and Helena in particular have done to develop the Corporate Venture in Brazil conference, which will be happening 25th and 26th of October, will really bring together the local ecosystem with the international one. So be excited to learn more at that point as well, Peter. Now, Eduardo, if I could turn to you. This all sounds very positive, but what's the mood of the entrepreneur? What is the conditions, and what do you think is required to actually support these entrepreneurs? How do you see these things?
Bom, James,
Well, James, first of all, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists here and Apex for having me here. Specifically Lucas, who is here with us today, and he's helped connect this all, and the work that you've been doing is really great. And I believe that everyone who has already been an entrepreneur knows how lonely and hard the entrepreneur's journey is. It's very rare being able to find an entrepreneur who is what we would like to call as a hipster or hacker or a hustler combined into a single individual, and someone who is aware of products, of technology, of management, business management. So when you add to it that Brazil, even though the effort that this government has done to improve the business environment and for entrepreneurship, Brazil is an extremely complex country for you to become an entrepreneur or become a businessman or a woman. So when you see the struggle of entrepreneurs on their daily routine, they spend most of their time managing the business and less time looking at their customers or their service. So that generates a number of problems. And what we do to help them on that regards is absorbing a bit of that load, of that burden that entrepreneurs have. So we help entrepreneurs, especially our focus, which is early stage entrepreneurs. We get like KPO, financials, we do all that part. We develop the digital area, the technology part, we support that a lot. Or we hire people who are actually not very present in entrepreneurs' facilities, so we make them focus on what their project is all about, and that helps a lot. And another very important question is implementing frameworks and operational playbooks. So we see many startups kind of lost in terms of operations to figure out how they can operate things efficiently. So whenever we put some steps to entrepreneurs that we know work efficiently, this makes them gain in terms of operations, and very significantly indeed. And it's very important for us to understand the business environment and the hardships that entrepreneurs have so that we can help them and make entrepreneurship flourish and becomes the largest engine of the economy. So we've already seen countries that were very successful, like the US, Germany, and a few others, who fostered entrepreneurship very seriously and had productivity gains and revenue gains that were very relevant in the long run. And this is something very relevant. So something that is also interesting for us to point out is that entrepreneurs need to have a global mindset. There's no use being otherwise. I believe that Brazil is like having like I'm the worst of the guys kind of complex. We have to understand that creating technology, well, technology actually tore barriers down. So it's not a thing building something in your country alone. You have to create something that could be expanded worldwide, that has a number of differences when you operate in Brazil or in the US, or you have to tune or fine-tune your business to meet that market's demands. And this is something that we tell our investors a lot, because perhaps they might now be competing with someone in Brazil or in India in the future. So they have to understand this global system, so that they can tackle this and be efficient in the long run and make their business scale and be successful. So these are very important points.
Thank you all. So I think in many ways we have some of the smartest people in the country here at the Brazil Investment Forum, and we've already found out that that's probably true, given that the answer was Brazil is the regional hub for Latin America in terms of venture capital. And it's not just you who thinks that. Today was published the Global Startup Entrepreneurial Hub report, and it looks at ecosystems around the world, about 140 of them. And Sao Paulo came 18th out of the 140th. It was by far the top, and Brazil hence was by far the most important region for startups and entrepreneurialism as an ecosystem in Latin America. And it even came above Florida. So congratulations to you all. Keep this ball rolling, because I'd be interested from you all if you have questions for this distinguished panel. So do make sure you put up your hand so we can see if you have questions. But I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a couple more myself. So it would be great to make this final session as interactive as possible. So please think of your questions. But I'll go back to you all and say, Brazil more broadly as this hub, You know, how do we think about some of the challenges or opportunities, ways that the government or entrepreneurs or other people within this ecosystem can help and support it? There might be issues around tax or valuations or even the capital markets and the globalizations that you talked to, Eduardo. So perhaps I'll turn to you first, Eduardo. You talked about taking the load off, some of the load off the entrepreneurs. But what challenges or opportunities do you see? What do you think could be improved in Brazil?
Bom, eu acho que o governo, como
Well, I think that the government has done very interesting initiatives related to it, because we could pinpoint some of them, like the startups, legal landmark, specific for angel investors, which we used to have many legal problems, but now this, well, has improved a lot. And that's very nice for the market. The IoT law, which is something that will be very strong in Brazil in the next years. Brazil as a which is a humongous consuming market, and that's fantastic. You again, the Apex work is incredible. That has helped the entrepreneurs take their work abroad, and that's very important for me. But what is primary for investments in private equity and venture capital? We are talking about not net investment. We're talking about investments from the middle to the long term. I think that the main thing that the government has brought us is a long-term stability. We had this difficulty in Brazil where the rules changed very frequently, and that brings uncertainty to investors, a very large uncertainty. And what is done by those investors? The return, the ROI rate is absurd, or even no investment. It's always made by those investors. So we have to understand what the scenario that those investors are betting in, or perhaps they could make more intelligent investments and charge a lower ROI. And this is something that we've seen in Brazil. And in the past 5 years, venture capital investments were nothing. And in the past, we had $9 billion investment. And for this year, the figure should be even higher. But interest rate is still very high, and despite of that, the growth will be there. And Brazil is one of the leading countries in terms of actual interest rates, and that makes our market very, very difficult. And on the other hand, investors, specifically from abroad, who are looking for Brazil, they can see this longevity and what Brazil should become in the next years. So this will still excite their appetite in investing in Brazil. So the point is, we should continue the policies that have been developed in Brazil. Unlike in the past, whenever a new government got in, and everything that had been developed so far was forgotten and start all over again, and that is very, very bad. So I believe that now we can have this continuity plan and a very firm base that was created by this government so that we could have very solid investments in the sector.
Eduardo. Piero, perhaps I'll turn to you next. What do you think some of the sort of challenges or opportunities could be?
Well, I believe that we have to look the path that we've made so far, like building our environment based on those very successful venture capital stories. I have 3 points here that I'd like to point out, and in my opinion are very important, that we should consider for the future, and those are: number one, we have to qualify people. When we think about venture capital environments, when you think about that, we are way behind in terms of having focused, qualified labor. You have, given the success of venture capital and given the fact that Brazil is actually a hub in America, in Latin America, or perhaps beyond Latin America, as we said, we are developing on that regard. But this has an employability potential that is huge in a country that has the need that it has, and we actually crave for qualified labor. Added value labor could change the history of income distribution in Brazil. We would think about the capacity and how many data engineers we could have or system developers that we could have as part of that environment. But this has to begin at some point. But in order for you to qualify those professions, well, this is a technical professional. He or she could be an engineer, but not someone who needs 10 years at college to have the proper qualified to produce something. So on the other hand, that potential of creating labor could apply to lower income populations, and that could apply to Brazil at large scale, specifically the moment that we are going through right now. But we've made very little effort to find those people. And here I'm talking about going through a process that has to begin perhaps when the kid is 10, 11 years. We have to get people not to make people not afraid of mathematics. So we should have focus programs to identify, to spot the talents in school so that we can provide that basic qualification to those kids so that they can grab this sort of markets. Unfortunately, in Brazil, when you're talking about focusing on developing an exact sciences area, that sounds something like elite or discriminatory, but much the contrary. The opportunities out there. We have to stop playing the good guy, that we have to have everything for everyone. No, we have to look for the opportunities and get the right people and spot the right people in the moment where the value is out there and the employment is there, the jobs are there, and the professionals are now attending school, like having the 12, 13-year-old guys at school, and perhaps in a 5-year period they will be ready to produce. So we have to focus on that, in my opinion. This is point number one. But point number two, perhaps it's something that has already been like oversighted. It's very important to cite that the cost of failing in Brazil is still very high. If you look American entrepreneurs in venture capital and for equity, we can see that there are many people who failure 4 or 5 times and made it in the sixth opportunity. And that's just an illustration. But in Brazil, if a company has failed just once or twice, when so the company is liable for all the failures, like the account is blocked, and the assets of the company or the company owner's assets are also blocked. So it's very expensive making failures in Brazil. So we can see this euphoria moment that entrepreneurs are going through right now in Brazil, but we can see the number of companies that also, I was talking about that to a colleague of mine, about the people who are the perhaps the most successful entrepreneurs on that regard. This Edson said, okay, we have to go through this funnel, and after that you could spot on the, you can appear on the other side, very well established, and it's very interesting to see that you can survive that period. And this is because you have a huge distortion caused by the high cost of making failures in Brazil. That's the so-called interliability line that we have. So it's something that we've already talked about, the legal landmark, but there's something that was not even that has not even scratched the surface of the business. This is something that has to be discussed in our Congress, and actually this is something that we discuss a lot at BVCAP, but this has to be made wider and rely on more stakeholders to take place, but it's far from being solved. But that would like de-bottleneck our system. But the third point that was mentioned here is related to the fact that Brazil is not constant, even in terms of past. We have to put an end to it. We see venture capital and private equity situations in Brazil that are related to Brazilian IRS that are scaring investors in Brazil. So they have a look in Brazil and say, well, I cannot invest in a country where I have invested in and de-invested in 2010, 11, and 14, and the rules were clear, and I reset my money because I was entitled not to pay capital gain on that money. And 6 years after, I am charged for something that was based on a rule that was absolutely clear back then. And this has been something that we've discussed internally at BVCAP for the past 4 or 5 years with many governments, since President Temer, and now with Eduardo, Mr. Minister Eduardo, and now with Minister Paulo. But it's something that is still not solved, something related to those rules, and that scares and rebukes investors. And that money that could be coming into Brazil, it's going to the Southeast Asia, like Indonesia as well, which are countries that have I mean, ecosystems that are not as developed as ours, but we know that investors are not putting their money in Brazil because of this scary framework. Because this environment is something that we cannot solve ourselves. And those things are things that our daily routine of making micro actions without public policies or the governmental will. We need those 2 factors. The challenges are few, but they are very clear, and we do have ways to solve them.
What do you see when you think about corporations and venture? What do you think around some of the opportunities and challenges are, particularly here in Brazil?
As oportunidades.
So as for opportunities, we have plenty of them. As I said, new technology, or use new markets, products, and applications that creates the opportunities for new revenue for corporations to invest like CVC, so that they can position themselves in the market, and we can also explore that future. But we also have the energetic transition, the decarbonization, where the driver is environment related, and that is accelerated by technology based on disruptive technologies as well. So it's a mega opportunity environment in Brazil and worldwide. So we are in tune of what's going what is going on in Brazil and worldwide. So the challenge is having, in my opinion, both for government and for entrepreneurs, something that would not letting the smoke of crisis affect the vision of entrepreneurship and richness creation, which is in the DNA of entrepreneurs. We always have crisis. And the economist says, and all economists say, and they can even foresee when the next crisis will take place. And I myself am an entrepreneur, and I created in 2014 a startup, and later I sold that startup to a bank. So we were born in a crisis in 2014, and in 2018 we had another crisis, and then the pandemic struck. Well, we will always have a crisis, but the very first challenge is mindset. We have to think middle to long term. So I need to have this competitive structure. I have to position myself in new businesses, otherwise we'll leave the market. So that's the biggest challenge that we have. I mean, we should not keep our eyes open only to the short term. Okay, we'll have some pressure put by the increased interest rate, but nevertheless, for those who have long-term directed mindset, we'll see this as a great opportunity for CVCs, for instance. And today at Veotech, out of the 6 funds that we have, 4 of them have just been captured. So we are perfect to get into the next 3 years to invest competitively. So this is the very first challenge. So this is challenge number 1, mindset changing. We should have these middle to long-term programs, and we also see the role of the government that should perform properly. And as for entrepreneurs, they have to position themselves like this startup that I just mentioned. I wouldn't be able to be successful at it if I couldn't be able to hire IT people who are familiar with algorithm and AI because of the crisis. Because in the past year, these professionals are very, very well paid, and sometimes people are even hiring labor from Brazil. So crisis equals opportunity. So the challenge is to plan yourself to have structuring consistent programs for the middle, from the middle to the long term, and something that is related to our structure in Brazil. So muito.
Now, one of the things that I think is really exciting about what Apex Brazil, along with ABVCAP under Piero, have been doing over the past few years is thinking about that globalization. How does money come into the country, and equally how does the local corporations and local entrepreneurs and VCs expand globally as well. And next week, Chris and Angela from ABVCAP are taking a delegation up to California to the Global Corporate Venture and Innovation Summit in Monterey, alongside Peter and a group of VCs and corporations to try and keep that globalization going. I think it's really important work that ABVCAP, along with Apex Brazil and sponsored by law firm Derek Menezes, is doing to build that ecosystem. So perhaps if we drill down a little bit more on what each of you were saying there, perhaps Peter, if I can ask you, when you think about CVCs and investment, are you just thinking, how do we think locally? Or are you starting to think, how do we help our clients, the mandates, go international to look for maybe American or other entrepreneurs and bring them to Brazil? Or vice versa, helping your portfolio companies expand globally and maybe have international mandates as well one day? What do you think about internationalization?
Tem se tornado mais frequente e agora uma tendência mais forte, né? As corporações, depois que já montaram seus primeiros fundos do CVC.
We're talking about the CVC. So some of the players that are thinking about the biggest of the operation here in Brazil, but investing in Europe, United States, and Israel. So it's opportunity to our. For me, Valitech, I'm going to the Silicon Valley next year to validate the Valitech operation in the abroad. Why? Because there are clients asking me that. So I'm strengthening my operational basis to invest globally. So pulled by the clients. It's going to be an excellent opportunity. So, if it was a shy initiative, now it has amplified the average ticket, and 100 million of reais is.
So that's the trend right now. So most of the funds are already born with 100 million US dollars affected, and now we are talking about like Suzano's funds, 70 million US dollars, and Vale is 600 million US dollars, and that has been announced in the past 30 days. And well, it's a AB3, 60 million reais, and now Vale is a fund that they are taking part in of 200 million reais. So in these past 30 days, we from Valitech have launched Anima Ventures, which is the Anima Education Fund. So those tickets have increased. So in addition to being born as a global vision fund, we do the FIP of investments in participations or equity dash investment in overseas. So we have no hindrances to make investments overseas. So that's a demand from our customers. And we have a fund that has involved interviews with the CEOs, and most of the results of those interviews state that we have a question like that says, how much can we invest abroad? But the answer is, well, we have no hindrances. If the figure is okay, we can make those investments. So that's a very nice opportunity for expanding overseas our Brazilian CVC. We have over 100 CVCs investing in Brazil. Remember that the figure that back in 2017 wouldn't fit in the hands, the fingers of your hands, and you wouldn't be able to count more than those meager number of investors. Now we have these great amount of investors, and we have to analyze the trend of turbo innovation that has just expedited in the past years. And this is something that is very technologically
interesting. And so, Eduardo, perhaps if we drill down, you talked about the importance of the administration. Obviously, there's an election this year. This year is also the 200th anniversary of Brazil's independence. So how do you think about the importance of continuity between administrations or keeping continuity? What would you want for to happen this year?
Olha, eu acho que independente.
Well, I believe that regardless of who is winning the elections, it's extremely important to understand what was done right in the previous administration, and it's even valid if this government remains in power and expand those initiatives and give a continuity flair to what we are implementing right now. So these ruptures that have been going on in Brazil since the 1980s are extremely deleterious and generate an uncertainty and a fear not only to international investors but also to national entrepreneurs. So when people are thinking about investing in a new plant or developing a new technology that will demand a high capital investment, these guys have to understand what the scenario will be that they will be able to negotiate and sell in or work with in the future. If that is not clear, it's very hard for those entrepreneurs to make that investment. And the Brazilian government is still most of that process. So in other countries where the government is not so strong-handed and private initiatives can navigate more freely, this is something that is still not happening in Brazil. We are still rely a lot on governmental actions, and unfortunately, some time ago, this was like schizophrenically done, and that has changed a lot in our present, based on what has been done now. We believe that the economic team of the Brazilian government has been able to meet those targets very smartly. So that provides entrepreneurs and businessmen and women with security, and they can say, okay, now I feel secure to make this investment, continue my work. And therefore, I believe that it's involving politicians seeing or looking at the long term and not only to the next election or to their popularity basis, but they should actually think about how they can help Brazil in the long run. And this is something that will actually generate income, revenue, and richness to Brazil. Brazil is a place of immense opportunities with a population, a consuming population that is absurd, like over 200 million people. And it's interesting because Brazil we have over 230 million smartphones, for instance. So it's a figure that the population is fond of technology. They want to be in tune with technology. We are perhaps among the top 5 consumers of social media consumers. So it shows how connected Brazil is and the opportunities that we have in Brazil. So you must have continuity in this process, and that should be done seriously. And that was a very important initiative of the current government, and I sincerely hope that that should continue in the future, and it will change the Brazilians' face for the next 5 to 10 years.
Piero, in your opening remarks about the data, you gave a really powerful data point around how many of the IPOs, the initial public offerings in the Brazil Stock Exchange, had been previously private equity or venture capital backed. And so, do you think, as you look at the stock exchange now, that those companies, because they have had private backing and they understand this tool, do you think that they're more likely perhaps to engage with the entrepreneurs, to buy them, to invest in them because they have that experience? Do you think we're starting to see this systemic change in the country's business culture towards innovation and collaboration and working to create global opportunities?
Acho que sem dúvida nenhuma. A gente tem...
Yes, no doubt. As like any other market, and I think that we are at that stage for the Brazilian capital market. I believe that Brazil's capital market is not like it used to be as before, like where 8 to 10 people would control all the indices, and most of them would not be actually reflecting the real economics. So the Bovespa index is no longer what it used to be in the past. And back then, like 5 or 6 years ago, we were talking about oil, commodities, and telecom. That was not real economy. So now you ought to have in the stock exchange a good set of companies that reflect the real economy. But the trend in a country that all the issues that we have, all the challenges that we have, and of which everyone is aware, and that we have made it clear here. So Brazil is a country that has this good capitalism bias in regards that we have no taxation of foreign capital coming in and no restrictions to transactions. We have good laws. We have a good business environment, and which is well established. We also have, or at least most of multinational companies have been operating in Brazil for quite some time now. So we have a mature environment. And the challenges that we have now relate to bureaucracy on the side of some corporations that were formed in the last 20, 30 years and that have some privileges, and society has reacted to that actually. So where do you like to get with that? So it's a very natural evolution, like having companies that are listed, that they will create this environment, that they will have such a return. Well, I wouldn't expect anything else or anything otherwise. So even the fact that we have seen the CVCs popping up and larger companies creating their own independent investment verticals so that they can foster entrepreneurship, they know that they have a very favorable environment to achieve that here in Brazil. So in the future, we will expect such a situation to take place even more frequently. So as we said, we have these investments all over the world being made by CBCs. I wouldn't expect anything else. So we perhaps should face some more competition in terms of private equity, but it's a healthy competition. Well, I am kind of fond of that sort of competition.
Finish there, Eduardo, on that point. So I just want to, we'll close a couple of minutes early if we can, but I wanted to just give a couple of reflections from what we see. You know, firstly, it's fascinating to come here and see the dynamism, not just in Sao Paulo, but across the country itself. I really feel that Brazil is at this inflection point. You know, if I remember my first trip back in 2015 to Sao Paulo, courtesy of ApexBrasil, we were thinking about doing some work together, and it felt quite challenged. There were about 600 or so entrepreneurs that were really engaging. There was a handful, as Peter says, of good corporates starting to think about venture investing. There were some good private equity firms like Warburg Pincus, and there were a handful of really good VCs that were really trying to support and engage longer term with the ecosystem. Now we're talking about 22,000 plus entrepreneurs. We're talking hundreds of billions of reais coming into the ecosystem to support at all stages of development. And I really think that Brazil's opportunities is almost because it's happened so quickly. It creates a real good case study or role model for other countries to think about how it develops the institutions, the regimes, the tax, the governance to support as the local entrepreneurs. But it also creates a risk. We all know that as interest rates rise, as inflation is coming in, there's geopolitics, there's wars in certain countries, that economically, the headwinds are likely to increase. And so if Brazil's leadership to become more open to globalization, to show how an ecosystem can support entrepreneurialism through corporates, through VCs, through private equity firms, through institutional funding, then that role model, that leadership will help not just Brazil, it will help the world through these next few years, which will be undoubtedly more difficult. So I think the opportunity to be able to lean in and showcase Brazil as that global opportunity is important. Now, equally, because so many of the VCs and the corporates and the institutional funding is still quite new, they haven't been through that economic cycle. And so that creates a risk of retreat, of people pulling back, in which case Brazil will sadly be a role model or case study of what could have been, that potential that was taken back and retreating back maybe 15, 20 years in terms of the capital markets. It took about 17 years after the dot-com boom and bust for the NASDAQ to regain its former heights. We don't want Brazil to be in a similar situation. And for me, coming back in 2040 and going, well, it's nice to see people here again. I think the opportunity for you all is to say, let us create the global case study of best practices. And I'm excited to hear from you all about how that vision can be realized. So let me say thank you for the invitation. Thank you to our distinguished panelists. And let me join you all in saying thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for your excellent moderation, and to all of our panelists, thank you. Obrigada à excelente moderação feita por James e a todos os nossos painelistas. O nosso muito obrigada.
Thank you very much.
A partir de agora, as nossas atividades se concentrarão apenas na plenária de número 1, onde vamos acompanhar uma discussão sobre as perspectivas e imagem brasileiras. Aos que estão acompanhando o Fórum de Investimentos Brasil 2022 pela internet, basta acessar a plataforma, a plenária 1, através da nossa plataforma oficial. Eu encerro aqui a minha participação, agradecendo a todos desde já que estiveram conosco presencialmente e online.
So far with us,
Até logo.
in person
Muito
and online.
obrigada.
Thank you very much, you all.
As inscrições para a 6ª edição do Corporate Venture em Brasil estão abertas. Participe do maior evento de Corporate Venture da América Latina, que em 2022 volta a ser presencial. Entre no ambiente de Venture Capital e Inovação do Brasil e aprenda mais sobre a inovação aberta e os investimentos de grandes corporações brasileiras e internacionais. Neste ano, a programação promoverá melhores práticas de CVC, relacionamento com empreendedores, VCs e estruturação de veículos de investimentos. Além disso, o conteúdo inclui cases de grandes corporações, dados e tendências globais de Corporate Venture. Tudo isso com a presença de corporates internacionais e muito mais. Não perca a 6ª edição do Corporate Venture em Brasil. Faça a sua inscrição e junte-se a nós.